Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 386. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. Hey folks, Guy here. Quickly before we get started, after having done over 380 interviews with the amazing guests that I am fortunate to bring on this podcast, one of the themes that continually comes up again and again and again is the importance of self-awareness, of authenticity, of presence and vulnerability, and how to cultivate that. This topic is my passion. It inspires me. Why? Because it's something that I've been on a journey to do, and all within the context of working with people who've been impacted by trauma. I want to invite you to join me for a live workshop September 20th through 22nd at the Incredible Art of Living Retreat Center in Boone, North Carolina. Once again, that's September 20th through 22nd. You can get all the information by going to theheartcenteredworkshop.com. That's theheartcenteredworkshop.com. I will see you there. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happening way too often. A nice looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create you a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off a new website as part of their 4th of July sale. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/guy. Again, that's brightervision.com/guy. Trauma may be a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Somatic Experiencing is a psychobiological method of addressing clients' physical and emotional trauma conditions and helps to give voice to their experiences without a need for them to retell their story. SE is a complementary modality that focuses on regulation of the nervous system and offers the opportunity to engage, complete, and resolve the body's instinctual responses to traumatic experiences. For more information regarding somatic experiencing and the SE professional training program, please visit www.traumahealing.org. That's www.traumahealing.org. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Dan Allender. Dan, welcome.
Guy, good to be with you.
All right. So Dr. Dan Allender has pioneered a unique and innovative approach to trauma and abuse therapy over the past 30 years. Central to Dr. Allender's theory and approach are the categories of faith, hope, and love, and their converses, betrayal, ambivalence, and powerlessness. Through identifying and engaging these categories in one's personal narrative, healing and transformation can occur by bridging the story of the gospel and the stories of trauma and abuse that mark so many. In 1997, Dan and a cadre of others founded the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology in order to train therapists, pastors, artists, and leaders to more effectively serve in the context of the 21st century. Dan is the author of The Wounded Heart, The Healing Path, To Be Told, and God Loves Sex. Dr. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you on here. Thank you so much.
Oh, a delight. I'll tell you, hearing, something of your own bio, actually I feel very exhausted when I hear it.
You feel exhausted? In what sense?
Yeah, life is far more than one's bio, but when I hear it, it's like, I don't know who did all that work.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. So where are you calling from, and where are you from originally? And then let's get going. Well,
I'm calling from Bainbridge Island, Washington, which is just a few miles off the coast of Seattle. Okay. So I live essentially in Seattle. And where I'm from, at least birth-wise, is Columbus, Ohio. But we spent 9 years in Denver, and I consider that far more my topographical home. So that's my world.
Okay, I see. So, I'm really excited to talk to you. I was introduced to you by a previous guest on here, And reading your bio, I thought to myself, all right, this gentleman's got to be on the podcast here. So let's start out as we sometimes do with a quote to kind of set the context. What do you have for us?
Well, it's something that shaped my college years and has remained as part of my way of thinking about life, is this old Zen koan, and that is, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And, I did some of my doctoral work on the role of dogmatism. And there's just something very dark about any form of self-righteousness, whether it's of the left or the right. And one of the things that studies in dogmatism show is there are just as many dogmatic Christians as there are dogmatic non-Christians. There's dogmatic Zionists as there are Palestinians. As you start looking at dogmatism, it really does rule and in many ways overwhelm the heart in providing a level of clarity of black and white that just isn't true to life. So in many ways, it's a matter of saying anything you think works probably eventually needs to be killed.
So when did that lightning bolt of realization come down and strike you?
Well, I've always been intrigued by religious studies or by people who have, in one sense, faith. Because faith is a form of trust, and trust is so hard to have in a world in which trauma is inevitable. So I think that sense of what has caused a person to say that they believe that there is no God versus that there is a God anyone who has faith, and everyone has faith, but anyone who actually lives on the basis of that faith has always intrigued me. So dogmatism has always been something that I've never been able to fully give myself to. And yet, on the other hand, I know my own proclivity to want to have clarity and understanding. Certainly being trained in psychoanalytic thought, I came to understand that that many of my peers and professors were as religiously committed to particular psychoanalytic thought with a level of critique. When I found out Lacan had been excommunicated, that was the word, excommunicated from the Parisian Psychoanalytic Society, it began to be clear to me that our work as psychologists or therapists, it is a form of faith. It is a form of, in many ways, religious understanding. We want to be scientific, and often we are, but somehow in the middle of trying to think all that through, I began to see that koan was a really helpful beginning point.
Mm. So how did this interest in trauma begin? I'd love to hear that story.
Well, I was working with a woman. I just got my doctorate. This was probably in 1987. And about the fourth session with her, she asked me, out of the blue, no context, what do you know about sexual abuse? And remember, one of those decisions where you just go, I'm going to lie. Because, at that point, I had a Master of Divinity, a Master of Science and Community Counseling, PhD, 11, 12 years of graduate education. At that point, I had not spent a single minute on the category of abuse or sexual abuse. So I didn't want to be outed as incompetent, but I also knew she was a client who would likely ask what I did know, and I knew that I knew nothing. So I finally decided in that millisecond to tell the truth. And I said, I really don't know anything. And her response was, I know you don't know. And then she made this remarkable proposition. She said, if you work with me, I'll teach you everything I know. And that was the beginning point of literally walking into a human heart with regard to the topic of trauma and abuse. And it was, to say the least, revelatory. So I can literally say, up to that point, how can you not know that people are traumatized? But I really hadn't thought it through in my therapeutic work or theoretical work and or literally, of course, my personal work. So that was the open door, kind of accidentally telling the truth.
So, yeah, I mean, I love that story. I love that image too. And the fact that she's like, I know you don't know anything about it. But, okay, the door's open. Why did you walk through it in the manner and with the passion that you did?
Well, I think, the role of attachment theory seemed to make a lot of sense to me early on in my work, even though attachment theory at that time was not highly connected to more psychoanalytic thought. But the whole notion that attunement is a way of talking about creating trust, which is another word in the world of religion, of faith. And that in many ways, the experience of containment, of being able to bear with another what they're experiencing, is another way of talking about the nature of what's required to develop hope, and the ability to repair rupture. Another word for that is the ability to forgive or to be in a relationship where there's a give and take of love. So in many ways, it began to be clear to me that attachment theory really fits well with the category of faith, hope, and love, which is, in many ways, if you look at Judaism, if you look at Islam, if you look at Christianity, so more monotheistic religious structures have those categories of faith, hope, and love. It's very central to their core dynamics. And just at that point, opened the door to beginning to go, oh my God, betrayal is inevitable to almost all abuse. I mean, grooming, setup, it's a devastation of trust, or another word, it fragments any form of faith. And so as I began to look at powerlessness, incredible that most of the people spoke about that as a loss of hope. And the experience, probably the hardest to put words to, is the ambivalence that comes particularly in abuse, that our bodies are touched, and that whether we want to be touched at that level of just having somebody pursue us, choose us, the bottom line is when our skin is touched, when our primary, secondary sexual body parts are touched, there is some level of arousal, even if there is the hatred of that arousal. So it began to be clear that these categories fit well with faith, hope, and love being the very essence of giving and receiving pleasure for the good of the other and for the good of oneself. So as I began to make these connections between, in many ways, psychoanalytic, attachment theory, and often faith statements within monotheistic religious structures, it began to get clear to me that in some ways, this is not just a devastation to one's own sense of self, to one's own connection to others, but ultimately to a sense of the ultimate good of life, or to, as Tillich would talk about, a sense of a divine being of goodness. So those categories just became central through the work with her. Again, I would look to this encounter as being one of those kind of an opening to thinking in ways that I had just never thought before.
So all of what you just said right now was going on in the wake of what this woman said, this particular client?
Literally, her tutelage, and again, it was a work that went on for several years, but as she began to name her own faith struggles, as she named her relational and her own internal self struggles, these categories started to make sense. And as we all do, we're in some sense heuristically working to make sense of people, ourselves, our own theoretical understanding. But things started to gel for me in a way in which I began soon after that writing a book called The Wounded Heart. And I was probably 4 or 5 chapters in when a good friend of mine came to a conference that I did on some of the material I just laid out for you. And at the end of it, he asked me this very simple question. He said, not many people at this point are talking about sexual abuse. This was around 1988. And he said, do you have a history of your own past abuse? And my response was no. And he said, really? And I said, really? And he said, really, really? And I said, yes, I have none. And then he said, really? You mean to tell me you've never felt sexually compromised, used, or ashamed? And when he asked that question, I just laughed and said, Yeah, I think I can think of a few times, like feeling used, feeling ashamed. And I told him a few stories about a scoutmaster, took me back to the car, exposed himself, asked me to touch him, and a few other experiences. And he sat in front of me weeping. And he said, "Are you telling me you've never been sexually abused?" And I looked at him and I said, "No." And he said, "But the very thing you've been teaching, do you not see that it fits your own life?" And I'm not going to claim to be a very bright man, but it was a moment in which literally the veil was broken in front of me. And I began to go, 2 plus 2. I mean, as simple as it may sound to you, it was a revelation that what I'd been teaching and writing, learning, actually was part of my own life. And so that opened the door to not only having a theoretical and a therapeutic orientation, but it was the shock, just utter shock, that I was writing about my own life but could not see it until my friend spoke that to me.
Wow. I mean, I think that's so often, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And from my experience here, that happens to a lot of us where people get into this field, for example, with the unconscious knowledge of the things that have compelled them or propelled them to do this work. So what, if anything, shifted for you when you realized that, when you understood that?
Well, it's odd to be, 4 chapters into a book, realizing in essence you're writing it to some degree about the unnamed, unstated realities of your own experience. So the book was really helpful. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say that, but it was a really helpful thing to begin to explore. I mean, I wasn't doing what could be called automatic writing, but I was doing writing, thinking about my clients, and then all of a sudden realizing you are, in many ways, lacking the courage to actually look at your own life and actually name, this is true for you as well. And so there was a shift from other to self, and then beginning to test it out with students and others to find that actually was helpful, particularly for religiously oriented people who had come to have those categories of faith, hope, and love, but never thought about the fact that faith, betrayal, hope, powerlessness, love, shame, and ambivalence are actually highly, highly correlated and need to be engaged if one is to grow in one's understanding of faith, hope, and love.
So having said that, how do you integrate or utilize those elements into the work you do?
Well, I think one of the things that I would hold that I'm sure that people would differ with is these are universals. It's like the pre-Socratics began talking about the reality of truth, goodness, and beauty. I would say that those core philosophical categories show up in all our work with people. In other words, there are universals. I'm certainly affected by postmodernism, postmodernism, and doubt the place of some overarching grand narrative that explains all things to all people. But on the other hand, there are universals that are true. I mean, we know that the amygdala, when it is harmed and the loss of something of the hippocampal size, that trauma is universal. And in many ways, the effects of trauma in broad senses has a certain universality. If that's accurate, then part of the work as I work with people is to trust that there are universals that people are striving for. They're trying to make sense of meaning in their life. They're trying to understand where they hold a sense of a grand purpose and narrative. So those questions, whether religious or not, people are struggling for what they trust and who they trust. Those are faith issues. And is there a future? I mean, can we look at something beyond the effects of global warming? Why we exist in post-apocalyptic language, Game of Thrones, in many ways, is a story about our current malaise of questioning whether or not power will eventually utterly devour us in a commitment to revenge. All that, I think we're still asking questions of what is the futurity of humanity? That's an issue of hope. And is love possible? Is it really possible? Is there faithfulness in relationship that can actually be grown? So these are categories. When I say the phrase, everyone's religious. Everyone's religious. Everyone's got a faith orientation. So whether I'm working with people who say they are Christians, non-Christians, Wiccas, anyone, the question ultimately is, what are you doing with faith, hope, and love? But also, what are you doing with the effects of betrayal, powerlessness, and shame and ambivalence? So once those categories are not intruded, but are heard on the part of people struggling with meaning, then I think you are able to invite people to a larger, in many ways, drama than just the drama of their own personal healing and their own current relationships. And that is to the larger, really striking home category of what do we do with ultimate concerns with regard to life.
Mm-hmm. What strikes me about what you're saying, Dan, is it almost feels to me like you're reaching into the gut, the core of the person sitting in front of you and saying, look, this is the life force, it's here. And oftentimes, as we all know, it's not always easy for someone to see that or feel that or to know it's there for someone who's been traumatized, right?
Right.
What is the process for you to even bring these elements on the table for discussion in the first place?
Yeah, and I think thank you for that question, because I don't feel like I bring them. I feel like people bring them, and that part of my labor is helping people, in one sense, name something of their localized war with the larger universality of human existence. In other words, existentialism as a core. Yalom's beautiful work is, in some ways, an existential psychotherapy that is bringing the reality that death is inevitable. And death as inevitable means that in some ways suffering is inevitable. And I really want to say, in a world like ours, trauma and abuse is inevitable. I don't know anybody that I've worked with who has not suffered what many of us call small t trauma. Mm-hmm. Violations of attachment, violations of human dignity, even if they're microaggressions. Many of the African-American clients and Asian clients that I work with experience massive microaggressions that are like 1,000 pinpricks that eventually are like a knife blow. And often our structures, I think both academic, meaning schools, churches, social institutions, actually want to minimize looking at the effects. It's one of the reasons I like ACEs, because it's opening the door to the question of when you've got an 8-year-old, 10-year-old who's acting out in a classroom, rather than simply view that as a troubled kid, now the category of a traumatized kid allows us a far different agenda to engage that person and their larger family. So I think in some ways, trauma is closer to the reality of what I would call living in a world like ours, living in a fallen world. So, it's not a matter of some people have been traumatized. It's you can't live without trauma. So how will we engage that both individually, familially, maritally, and culturally? I think it's an exciting era, oh my gosh, to be a trauma therapist. And I don't actually understand how any therapist can think of themselves as other than a trauma therapist.
Mm-hmm. How did the school come about?
Well, that's an infinitely long question, but let's just say unadulterated arrogance is the best answer.
Let me ask you a different question. Why did you found the school?
Well, a number of us thought that we could engage theology and psychology more effectively than our past education. As academics, we didn't realize that administrators actually do a lot. And we sucked at administration and actually at what it meant to run a school or start or run a school. So, hubris, I think, is a great gift that actually opens the door to a lot of ambition, but eventually to massive amounts of humility. So the school has existed for 22 years in spite of us. I would say.
Dan, one of the things you talked about that keeps coming up for me is, when you realized your own past, what had happened to you, and you kind of looked at that a different way. So on the one hand, that's there. On the other hand, there's a lot of people in this field and in this specialization talk a lot about the importance of clinicians doing their own inner work. Did that change for you after this realization?
I think it did. I mean, again, I love the degree that I went through at Michigan State in counseling psychology. I love the people who taught me, but it wasn't an era where really doing your own personal work was that important. And I think it's grown over the last 2, 3, 4 decades to a point where, our students cannot graduate without at least 40 some hours of individual psychotherapy. A lot of programs are making that a far greater, shall we say, calling for people to look at their own lives. But I'd also underline that this is, I know it's a truism, but when I train psychotherapists, what I find is most people are committed to their model and to their own sense of competency in living it out. The idea that there's always new models, new ways of thinking, and also new avenues for thinking about your own life. All of us are prone to dogmatism. And as a field, you would think we would be the first and foremost to be open to looking at our own life. But I also find that many people who espouse that, when they actually are at a point where they're being challenged with regard to sort of the core convictions that operate the model and their own practice, get really defensive. And in that sense, we are human. And in our humanity, it is a very hard thing. So I think in many ways, like my wife has begun doing a lot more work in the Enneagram. And I've always known enough about it to be able to interact with clients, but I haven't really given it a whole lot of thought. And so as she began to say, let's think about this, I just found myself going, I'm old. I don't have a much more brain space for a whole new way of thinking. Well, my daughter is what could be called a 5-element acupuncturist, and she began bringing Chinese medicine into conversations about personality. I found the same kind of defensiveness. Like, I'm sure there's some value to it, but I don't want to have to think new thoughts. Well, your own ambivalence is a hard thing to name as an ongoing reality that often limits how we engage not only our own trauma and life, but how we engage new ideas that we might know about, but actually have not really thought through for our lives. And I think to the degree we can admit that we're prone to our own self-righteousness or another form of dogmatism, I think opens the possibility for us to actually be able to step back and say, we're a pretty defensive field.
Well, why do you think that is? I mean, when you're talking about training new therapists, why do you think that is? As a generalization, as a field, people are, I don't want to say loath to doing inner work, but maybe don't always practice what they preach.
Well, I think we're a pretty liberal field. And I know that liberal conservative is a very unhelpful, but it's still useful category. And as a more liberal field, we oftentimes think we're far more open than we are. We're open against certain categories of conservatism. But when we actually get challenged, I don't know, it's probably not best to quote something, but I'm a follower of The Onion. Do you know what The Onion is? And they had an article yesterday or the day before about a liberal in Madison, Wisconsin, who had realized he no longer has to do any more self-evaluation because he has finally realized all the opinions that he holds are true. Well, in many ways, what a hilarious critique of us, that we are so open, that we have not faced where we are actually quite closed. So I think, again, humility, a kind of humility, not only a lifetime learner, but actually able to name your own fundamental darkness, your own demands, something of your own commitment to really a term that, again, comes out of a religious world, but our own idolatry of ideas that often don't get, in many ways, iconoclastically challenged to then be able to rethink our lives.
This topic of trauma and the topic of spirituality or religiousness is juxtaposed. There's in a sense there's a tension there. But you're also saying that trauma is inevitable, and I would agree with that. What was it, or is it about you that allows you to do this work? I mean, you talked about the Zen koan and getting into that field, but trauma to me seems there's a difference there. I mean, it's to me it's really difficult to talk about. It's ugly. It's hard. What do you think it was about you, or is about you, Dan, that allows you to walk in that path, if you will?
Well, my father was Jewish, my mother Goyish or Gentile. So already I will not fit. I mean, I was with a group of Israelis going through what's called a monument to the Holocaust in Prague. And we were chatting, and the woman looked at me and she said, "Are you Jewish?" And I hesitated, and I went, and she looked at me, she goes, "Your father, he was Jewish. Your mother was Gentile." And I said, "Yes." She goes, "You're a bastard." And, and Hitler would have thought I was a Jew. But at least for many, many years, I could never have applied for Israeli citizenship because a Jew wouldn't actually think of me as a Jew. So in that sense, being an outsider, I think if you look at most good trauma therapists, I think they have known what it is to be an outsider. And so I've never really fit my own Christian faith. Many churches would not be particularly interested, especially in the 80s, 90s, really today, with somebody saying, we have to address abuse and trauma. Often churches, synagogues, any religious establishment is very uncomfortable to actually address what they call sin, especially when it has to do with sexual violation of other human beings. So in that sense, as an outsider, I think there's been something in me that's, of course, wanted to be an insider, and yet come to realize that it is well to have one foot in the world and one foot not in the world. I would call myself a follower of Jesus, and yet many would not see me to be that way. And so in that sense, the questions I ask, the fact of not really quite fitting, small t trauma. If I look back and went, if you looked at my story, my mother fit far more the category of borderline personality disorder. My father far more a category of avoidant personality disorder. Caught in the middle as an only child. In one sense, trauma is not just event, it's structure. There are institutions which the very nature of which are traumatic, and many homes we know only too well are traumatic. So I think in some ways there was this deep river of trauma in my own life, and with everything from drugs to selling drugs to eventually being excited by the academy. I think I've had many ways to numb the hard questions that trauma forces you to face about any faith that you hold. Can anyone be trusted? If there's a God, can that God, he or she, be trusted? What does it mean to have a God whom you think of as personal? All these questions, from my standpoint, are trauma questions. Not alone trauma, but centrally. I think there are questions that arise out of the nature of trauma. So in some ways, I now looking back retrospectively to my life, I'm I, like many, grew up in an era, the Vietnam era, trauma. But if you grew up in World War II, trauma. If you grew up as my parents did, in the Depression, trauma. We don't have a period of time in our country, in our world. So in one sense, I don't know if I'm putting it well for you at all, Guy, but I don't know how you can actually look at the world, literally the evening news tonight with what Trump has done, right, and not go, it's insanely traumatic. So in that sense, I think I woke up. I think my client and a few other friends just invited me to wake up to my own life.
As we get ready to close out here, you've got 3 or so therapists sitting in front of you, new therapists, eager to learn about trauma. What do you say to them? What do you advise them or suggest to them?
Be intrigued by your own erotic structure. What brings you arousal? What brings you pleasure? And that can be sexually, but when I use the word erotic, I don't mean primarily sexual. I mean, what sense of beloved in the world arouses you that actually gives you a sense of both power and meaning and goodness? When you begin to explore your own ambivalence, you want to be loved. You don't want to be known. You want to pursue. You want to back off. When you begin to explore ambivalence, I think you're closer to the realm of where trauma affects us with regard to desire. And I think desire is the very core cusp of where we live out our trauma in reenactment again and again and again. The closer we can get to our own war with desire, with love, with arousal, I think we're then clearer, not so much that our life is then a replica of others, but our own war with arousal and pleasure and desire, and how we have bound shame to it. It becomes a universal that allows us far greater connection to other people's core suffering.
Well, Dan, 30 minutes is not enough here. I think that's clear to see here. So I'm speaking with Dr. Dan Allender. Dan, your website is theallendercenter.org. How about a go-to book recommendation from you?
Well, I've been working, as I said, with a number of African-American clients, and I literally fell onto this book. It's called At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle McGuire. And the subtitle is Black Women, Rape and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. It is a book about trauma, but it's a book that is not, shall we just say, therapeutically oriented, but historically oriented to what our Black friends and clients have suffered, particularly through the use of sexual power. You really can't understand Black experience, from my standpoint now, without understanding the role of plantation rape and the implications for how it's been used in North and South. So I think it's a really important book that trauma therapists get a hold of.
Okay. And I'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So finally, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Through our website.
Okay.
Again, I don't think there are that many people that are that focused on trauma. Thankfully, Vanderkok and others have opened a great door for us to be talking in the way we're talking about. But still, when I interact with therapists, I don't hear them talking about trauma enough. So anytime that we can in any way align with a community, as you've done so well through your 2.0, it is a good deal. It's a very good deal.
I appreciate that. All right, Dan, it's been a pleasure having you on here. Thank you so much.
Guy, thank you.
All right, take care. The Foundation for Human Enrichment, DBA Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE professional training at www.traumahealing.org. That's www.traumahealing.org. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As a worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happening way too often. A nice looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create you a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off a new website as part of their 4th of July sale. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/guy. Again, that's brightervision.com/guy.